The word agroforestry kind of tells you what it is. So basically a combination of traditional agriculture with forestry, and that's where the word comes from. It's not just kind of throwing things together, but it's really intentionally working on both and combining them both to create economic benefit, to create an environmental benefit, and hopefully also a social benefit. So it's combining these, the agricultural part and the forestry part into one intentional design system. So the agricultural knowledge and the selection of the species and the management of the trees, all of that is sort of needed to optimize production in the system and to minimize any competitive effects. But broadly, agroforestry systems are classified based on what kind of species are involved in it. So in the first type, it's called the agri-silviculture systems. You have trees and crops combined. And then in the second type, you have silvopastoral systems, which basically connects the trees and livestock. So the trees are always in there. And then the agro-silvopastoral system, where you have all three. You have trees and crops and livestock, all of that combined. On the pictures here, you see kind of a traditional alley cropping system on the left. In the middle, you see more of a forest farming type system, also called multi-story cropping sometimes. And then over here, you have sort of a silvopastoral system where you pasture. Actually, in this case, you also have the animals. So it would be a full-on agro-silvopastoral system here. This shows also a slide of that. And that's really the most complex type because there is a lot going on, obviously, in that. There's a lot of interactions between the animals and the crops and the crops and the trees and the trees and the animals. So there's a lot to consider in that system. And from what I've seen in my short visit to Bhutan, this is actually quite applicable to your situation in your country. I've seen many of these systems. They were not necessarily intentional. If you would make them more intentional, I think there would be a big potential. And certainly when you are finished with your studies at CNR and you go out and have a job, there is much for you to optimize these systems since they're already out there. So why agroforestry? The point is that we're trying to optimize a system that is somehow advantageous over just the agricultural and just the forest production by having more economic benefits and enhanced outcomes and services. And I'll just put up a full list, and then we actually go through those benefits more one by one later on. But you produce multiple products because you have tree products and the crop products and animal products. There is a chance that you can optimize that and actually then increase crop yield and livestock production for a particular area. You have spreading of the risk because you have multiple products that are coming on at different times. You have the potential for maybe creating value-added products, especially on the forest side, because you can do many different things with the timber that you harvest there, but also on the crop side to a certain degree. And then it does increase property value as well. Another general point, how is it connected to sustainability? And there's really a number of ways kind of how agroforestry contributes to sustainability in the bigger picture. Certainly there are economic benefits. We'll talk about those and the products that you produce there. But there's also the environmental benefits. And again, we'll talk about carbon sequestration and how it may contribute to also cleaner water and air. And then a number of social benefits that you would have over kind of the monocropping type system of crop production or only tree production. I'd like to go into a little bit about what generally we have on benefits when we put multiple species together. You already talked about much of that, but I want to set the stage a little bit so then it's easier to understand the alley cropping. With any cropping system that puts more than one species into a field, your hope is that there is some advantages to that in terms of overall productivity. You're trying to optimize the resources that you have, and we'll look at that. We are trying to potentially get some pest management benefits out of that, reducing pest management, reducing pest damage. And then you're trying to provide greater stability in terms of cash flow, in terms of human nutrition, in terms of overall sustainability. And so when we look at some of these a little bit more, how do you increase productivity compared to monocrops? Because, if you look around the world, most crops are produced in monocrops. So gigantic fields, at least in those countries where you have those fields, very big fields, all a single crop. And there are good reasons for that. But especially on smaller acreages and where you have more limitations on the land, there is a good reason why you might want to do multiple cropping or multiple crops in one particular field. So just bear with me here, just a simple example, and it's just totally hypothetical. If you have an acre or a certain area and it produces a certain yield, and another second area then produces a second crop, also a certain yield. So your hope is that if you combine that, you will get actually more. And there it depends very much on how you put the crops together, what kind of crops you're putting together. Ideally, you put crops together that have different needs, because then they use resources in a much better way. So, for example, this is just hypothetical, but you might actually reduce the corn yield because corn is quite susceptible to competition. So you might actually only have half of that. But pumpkins or squashes are less susceptible to a lot of the resource competition, and they might produce more. So in the end, you end up with something more, and thereby increasing your overall productivity. Whether or not that makes sense, it depends always on the individual farming system. If this makes a whole lot more work, it might not be worth it. But if it's not making more work and maybe actually reducing work because potentially the pumpkins cover the ground much better, so you don't have to do as much weed management, then actually it would be a nice thing. So when we talk about optimizing resources, that's resources meaning land, labor, time, natural resources. And on the natural resource side, we're talking about light and nutrients and water that we're trying to optimize in the system that has multiple crops in the same field. And our goal is to minimize the competition for those resources, but at the same time, maximize any kind of sharing that's going on. So sometimes some crops like shading, for example, and they grow better under a little bit of shade. Some crops benefit maybe from if one crop has nitrogen fixing ability and then they give up some nitrogen to the crop next to it. There are different ways of how you can manage or how you can design a system that does that. But basically, we're always trying to look at these intercrops when you grow multiple things together and see what resources are not fully used and can we change which crops we're using so they're not using the same resource, but they're different in space and in the time dimension. And so they share different resource pools. So that's our goal here. So this is an example of a bok choy field. But above it, you can see they grow kiwis. So this is a great example of resource sharing. So space is used very efficiently because the crops grow on the same area, but on different levels. So it uses the light very efficiently, especially if the bok choy has most of its growth time during the time when the kiwi plants have not a lot of leaves on them. So this is a nice example of how you can use different resource pools. Very likely the farmer also makes good use of the soil resources because the roots of the woody plants here extract the nutrients from deeper down and also the water. In addition, labor is used very efficiently because the harvest time of the two crops is different. Here's an example of an intercrop in Oregon. And in a way, that's not really in the traditional sense of an intercrop because the cereal that's grown here in the middle is not really used. It's simply there to protect those young melon seedlings. This is in an area where there's a lot of wind and the melon seedlings have a hard time getting established. And so they grow this cereal, they kill it, in this case, chemically, looks like. And then in this time, the melon seedlings can establish themselves. And then this completely dies back and the melons just grow over that. So it's sort of facilitating, this crop facilitates the growth of the other crop. More traditionally, this would be how hazelnuts are grown in Oregon in pretty wide spacing because they get very large. But before they close canopy, the grower can make use in those first few years when the trees are not yet bearing nuts. In that time, and when there's a lot of space and there's a lot of light available, they can grow an intercrop. And then later they will stop doing that. But for some years, they can grow beans or other plants in between. Good example of how resources are shared. And as I said, in most agroforestry and also intercropping systems, you also have a good potential for having reduced pest damage, especially insect pests, because you can create different habitat, especially if you have a multi-story, trees available. So you have a lot of habitat complexity in the trees, and that provides a lot of habitat for beneficial insects that could potentially then feed on insect pests that are in the alleys. In addition, and I'm just using an example not out of agroforestry, but you have a good potential for having one of the species, either the trees or something else that grows in between, that can attract natural enemies and other crops that may be pushing out, so that maybe have volatile chemicals that the insects don't like, and so it pushes them away, actually out of the crop. So you have that potential in agroforestry for having more habitat, but also for creating attractive plants to enemies and very non-attractive plants to pests. So I'm going to end it right here.